Okay, after German defeats in Stalingrad and North Africa, the Allies continue to advance, and they're pushing Germany back on the Eastern Front from the Russian end. They're moving up the Italian peninsula from North Africa. And really, what they need to do, the last thing they need to do to complete their strategy, is they need to go ahead and launch an invasion of Europe proper, of Northern Europe. And that invasion happens at a place called Normandy in northern France. They need to do this for various different reasons. They need to go ahead and relieve some pressure from the Russians, because the Russians are absolutely getting hammered. Even though they're winning, they're losing lots of soldiers. And the Italian campaign is getting to the top of the peninsula, and so they want to be able to meet up with it and cut the Germans in half a little bit. So there's several reasons why they go ahead and choose to invade Normandy. The code name for the operation is called Operation Overlord. And again, as I've already mentioned, it takes place on the northern coast of France. The invasion begins on June 6th, 1944, and at the time was the largest combined operation in history. It actually takes place in three stages. The first stage is comprised of gliders and paratroopers. This actually begins, the day before June 5th, late in the evening. The planes take off, and the gliders are towed across. Literally, they're made out of balsa wood. They're flying over enemy territory in gliders in black, made out of balsa wood, and they drop paratroopers behind enemy lines. And the purpose here was to try to cause confusion by getting soldiers behind the German lines. And the purpose was then for them to cut communication lines, and also they were supposed to mark the invasion route. Again, some of the first guys to do this. These are forerunners of modern-day special forces. They were called pathfinders, but they literally were jumped in and they had a can of spray paint. And they were supposed to mark out the route with certain symbols marked in certain colors, so the different units, once they landed on the beach the next day, could follow those to their rally points where they'd all get together and be able to go ahead and carry out their mission. The second stage then begins in the early morning hours of June the 6th, so before any soldiers are landed. It's a massive shore bombardment from the naval artillery, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, things like that. And the idea was to try to unnerve the enemy and kill as many of them as we could before the eventual invasion came. And that invasion came in the third stage, where we actually landed the troops. There are 5 different beachheads, 2 that are responsibility of the Americans, Utah and Omaha Beach. And when people think of Normandy, this is what they think of. This is the Saving Private Ryan, kind of thing, image where people are dying in the surf there. This is really what people think of when they think of the invasion of Normandy. There were 3 other beachheads, Sword, Gold, and Juno. But the American beachheads that we were responsible for were Utah and Omaha Beach. So why did we pick Normandy, and why did we pick June 6th? Well, we picked June 6th because the Russians were really putting a lot of pressure on us. We needed to get done early. The Russians were over there screaming at us, hey, we're taking huge casualties. You got to get in the fight. You got to open a second front. And our forces in Italy had been doing really, really well. And we were afraid that if they got to the northern tip of that peninsula and came out into Europe, that they would be vulnerable and they'd be able to go ahead and be cut off from behind by German forces. So we really wanted to meet up with our forces coming up from Italy. And so those 2 things were big and important factors about why we picked the date we did. Other reasons why had to do with the weather and the tides. We wanted an exceptionally high tide so that we could sail over a lot of the barricades and a lot of the barriers that the Germans had placed on the beaches there at Normandy. So we had to wait for full moons. We had to wait for things to be just right. So that the tide would be exceptionally high. June 6th was one such date. The next available date would have been in August. We chose to do this in the summer because in the fall and spring and winter, the weather on the English Channel is terrible. It's never very good, but the storms are brutal, the waves are brutal, and so really during those seasons, it's really not much of an option. So if we had missed the June deadline, we had another August date that was possible, and then if we missed the August date, it would have had to wait a whole other year before we would have had another opportunity to go ahead and launch our invasion of Normandy. So those are all factors that answered the question of why June 6th. Why Normandy, though? Well, Normandy was about as far as our supply lines could stretch and as far as our fighters could support us. If we took our fighters off from England, they could spend about 20 minutes over the beaches providing us cover from the German Luftwaffe. And so we really couldn't go any further down the coast. And we didn't want to go further up the coast because that was closer to Calais. And we had basically tricked the Germans into expecting an invasion at Calais. So they had all of their defenses at Calais. It was the logical place. It was the closest that France was. It was the easiest place to cross. And so we didn't want to come there because the Germans were expecting it there. And in fact, we had really misled them to expect it there. We had given them fake invasion plans. We had the British actually had crashed a plane in the Mediterranean with a man dressed in an Air Force Major's uniform with fake invasion plans, which had an invasion coming in Calais with a distracting invasion or a false invasion at Normandy. So they were expecting this. Further, we knew that the Germans, because we had intercepted their codes, were obsessed with George Patton. He was on trial for slapping a soldier, actually more than once, but the Germans believed there's no way we'd keep him out of the fight because he had slapped this soldier, and so they were absolutely obsessed with him. So while he was standing trial for these actions, we sent him on a speaking tour all along the southern coast of England, right across the channel from Calais. And so the Germans reasoned, hey, if Patton's across the channel from Calais, we know where the invasion's coming. It's coming at Calais. And the British, in order to go ahead and cement this, they knew that the German Luftwaffe, when they flew over England to bomb London or that, they'd actually enlisted the aid of a lot of the theater personnel, and they had built basically inflatable tanks and trucks, and there was a whole unit of Brits that was dedicated to just moving them around every night, so it looked like they were parked in different places. So whenever the Germans overflew, they looked down and see all these tanks and all these planes, and from that high up in the air, you couldn't tell that they were just inflatable. And so we were trying to deceive them. On top of that, we erected a whole camp right across the channel from Calais, and no soldiers were in there. So where were our soldiers that we were massing for the invasion? Well, we literally put them in the dump. We had brought over all these supplies for the invasion in crates, and we had taken these crates and stacked them, and it looked like a gigantic garbage dump. But in reality, what it was is our men were living inside those crates instead of inside the tents. And so that was another way that we deceived the Germans so that they thought the invasion was coming at Calais. They were so convinced of it, they held out their best panzer divisions, their best tank units, for 2 weeks. They held them at Calais expecting an invasion to come there. And by the time they realized there was no invasion coming at Calais, it was too late. We had established a beachhead in Normandy, and we were successful. Had they moved those tanks and those reinforcements in right away on June 6th, we probably would have been pushed back into the sea, and the invasion probably would have failed. But as it was, the deception was so complete that the Germans held out those vital reinforcements for too long, and then it was too late. Another reason why we won was just the German defenses. The German defenses, all of their best soldiers, most of them, were fighting the Russians. And so the defenses at Normandy were relatively weak. Most of the defenders were either young boys, 16, 17, 18 years old, or old men, guys who were 40 and older. And when you put a bunch of teenagers and a bunch of old guys up against a bunch of 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, well, the 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds win. The young guys and the old men lose. On top of that, the Germans had taken a lot of Russian captives and had lined them up along the coast of Normandy, and those were actually folks they used to defend Normandy. What they would do is they'd line the Russians up in a trench, they'd give them all guns, and then they'd put one German down at the end of the trench with a machine gun, and the machine gun would be pointed right down the trench, so that if the Russians weren't shooting or aim their guns somewhere other than at the advancing Americans and Brits, then the German would open up with his machine gun and kill all of the Russians right down the trench. That was the idea. So really their defenders were not exactly crack forces, and that was another thing that led to their defeat. Once we get through Normandy, it goes fast. It doesn't take long. December 16th, 1944 was the Battle of the Bulge. It's the last major German offensive. It's approximately 250,000 German troops. This is the last effective army the Germans have. It's made up of SS soldiers and pretty good forces. And they come really close to winning that. They try to break through, but we hold at a place called Bastogne. The 101st Airborne gets its reputation there, and we end up defeating them at the Battle of the Bulge. Then we cross the Rhine later in the spring, March 7th of 1945, at a place called Remagen. Again, we get pretty lucky here. The Germans had tried to blow up all the bridges along the Rhine. We're literally looking for a place to cross. The Rhine is a natural defensive barrier. And there's one bridge at this town called Remagen that the charges just didn't work. We had a platoon looking for a bridge. They recognize this one's up. They rush across to the other side, radio back. We go ahead and shore up the bridge because some of the charges had gone off, just not enough to knock it down. And we cross the Rhine. We're able to get across relatively unmolested as a result of discovering this one bridge that was still standing across the Rhine. And now you'll notice here, if we cross the Rhine, about a month later, we're all the way at the Elbe River in a town called Torgau, and that's where we meet the Russians. So we basically crossed the entire country of Germany in a month. They have no defenses left. And literally, again, it's actually an accident. It's a miracle we didn't end up fighting the Russians right there. We bump into each other. We're looking for a place to cross the Elbe River, and the American forces actually hear some guys on the other side who turns out are actually going to the bathroom, and they hear them talking. They're like, "Well, that's not German. What is that?" "Oh, it's Russian." And so we actually literally accidentally bump into one another, our two armies there at Torgau. So the last days of Hitler and some of his last actions, he kicks out Hermann Goering and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi party. He says, "I don't want to play your party anymore." On April 29th, he marries his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, and the next day they commit suicide together. The official surrender then won't come until May 7th. For the next week, it's really complete chaos because nobody knows who's in control. And finally, on May 7th, the highest ranking guy that we could still find was Admiral Dönitz in charge of the Navy. And he's the one who actually issues the formal surrender. Interesting side note, Dönitz was also tried at the trial of Nuremberg for war crimes, basically for torpedoing merchant ships on the high seas. And he was facing the death penalty. And Dönitz really felt like he owed his life to Chester Nimitz, who was the commander of the Pacific Fleet. Chester Nimitz intervened on his behalf and said, "Look, if you execute him for war crimes, then we're just as guilty because we've sunk merchant ships as well over in the Pacific." And Dönitz's life is spared. He receives a prison sentence, but he doesn't get the death penalty, and he lives out the rest of his life then in Germany and remains grateful till the end of his days. He actually carries out correspondence until he dies, I believe, in 1986 with the United States Naval Academy in gratitude for what Nimitz had done. So folks from the Naval Academy could write letters asking any question they wanted about World War II, and Dönitz would write a handwritten response. "Well, here's what we were thinking. Here's what we did. Here's why we did what we did." And so Dönitz finally goes ahead and issues the final surrender.